Hey everyone. Today I'd like to talk about Jean Baudrillard's essay, The Spirit of Terrorism, which can be found in this book, The Spirit of Terrorism, published by Verso Books. In this essay, Baudrillard looks at the aftermath of the September 11th attacks and looks at the implications of the new symbolic strategies of terrorist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda, and uses this to re-examine the goal of violence in contemporary society. Baudrillard begins by articulating how the exigency of contemporary terrorism lies not in the third world or the disadvantaged areas, but in fact the very heart of America and other privileged nations. That in fact there is a fomenting of these terrorist tendencies within America itself, stating very logically and inexorably the increase in the power of power heightens the will to destroy it, and it was party to its own destruction. When the two towers collapsed, you had the impression that they were responding to the suicide of the suicide plans with their own suicides. It has been said that even God cannot declare war on himself. Well, he can. The West, in the position of God, divine omnipotence, and absolute moral legitimacy, has become suicidal and declared war on itself. So Baudrillard wants to mention that in fact the problem of terrorism today is not some problem to be stamped out by, for example, continual paternalistic military intervention into the Middle East, East Asia, Africa, for example, but rather it comes from analyzing the internal dynamics of globalist superpowers such as the United States. The more concentrated the system becomes globally, ultimately forming one single network, the more it becomes vulnerable at a single point. As such, Baudrillard states that here it was 18 suicide attackers who, thanks to the absolute weapon of death, enhanced by technological efficiency, unleashed a global catastrophic process, which indeed they did, because Al-Qaeda is a Salafist movement. They are part of an ultra-fundamentalist strand of Islam that seeks to return to the original practices of Muhammad, gladly flaunting modernity and trying to escape to a pure divine law. And as a result, with, for example, the colonial imposition of various Western powers such as Britain, France, and the United States, these powers are now seen chiefly as enemies to God's will. They are an affront to moral strictures given by God and the commands of modesty, of self-debasement, of slavery to God's will, of submission to his will. Therefore, the real question is of the American system itself, of the way that in fact it has prompted and funded, in fact, these various terrorist organizations. Because if you know anything, for example, about the creation of Al-Qaeda, it comes from the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen being a group of Afghani fighters that was funded by the US government during the war with the Soviet Union in the 80s in Afghanistan. And as a result, they gained military training and technology that would later go on to be used to fuel their terrorist efforts and give them the technical capabilities by which to, for example, facilitate long-term and long-range communications. As such, Baudrillard writes, "It was the system itself which created the objective conditions for this brutal realization. By seizing all the cards for itself, it forced the other to change the rules. And the new rules are fierce ones because the stakes are fierce. To a system whose very excess of power poses an insoluble challenge, the terrorists respond with a definitive act which is also not susceptible of exchange. Terrorism is the act that restores an irreducible singularity to the heart of a system of generalized exchange. And this notion of generalized exchange and impossible exchange are two very important concepts in Baudrillard's oeuvre. Now, the idea of generalized exchange is something shared with theorists such as Deleuze and Guattari, where capitalism, for example, operates via very basic axioms such as profitability, expediency, the ability of quick oversight, the ability for there to be general exchange rates between currencies, such that it only matters that there are general codes overseeing the transfer rates between different currencies. This creates a global system of generalized exchange where now use value becomes trumped by exchange value. These are Marxian terms. Rather than something being important for what it does, it equally matters, if not more, now matters its value as an exchangeable commodity within a commodity and production-based society. Therefore, the real strength of terrorism for Baudrillard, and this is of course a very controversial aspect of contemporary critical theory, is Baudrillard's statements on terrorism, is the fact that it creates a system of impossible exchange, a gift or a sacrifice that cannot be returned, that cannot be absorbed without some irrevocable backlash on the system itself. And he doesn't want to reduce any of these terrorist attacks to simply ideology, because that makes it seem as if there is some clear enemy that can be co-opted, that can be destroyed, that can be reintegrated. No ideology, no cause, not even the Islamic cause, can account for the energy which fuels terror. The aim is no longer even to transform the world, but, as heresies did in their day, to radicalize the world by sacrifice. And if you look at, for example, some of the motivating strands behind Al-Qaeda, you can see that, in fact, this is exactly what they were doing, radicalizing the world by sacrifice. The point was to encourage and accelerate the means by which the first world, so to speak, would go into decay and confusion and chaos through the stimulation of suicide bombings, for example. Because what they were trying to do was Al-Qaeda was trying to incite violence, which would open up a chaotic space, which would motivate particularly young men to join the cause of Al-Qaeda. And of course, the goal was in part the establishment of an Islamic rule, but not necessarily an Islamic state, such as is the case with the Islamic State or the Al-Nusra Front, where these are active current movements trying to create an Islamic theocracy. But Al-Qaeda was not trying to do that. Al-Qaeda was merely trying to act as an instrument of God's will on earth, so to speak, to punish infidels and to reestablish the presence of God through the material incitement of sacrifice. But as equally as much as this is a material incitement, it is a symbolic incitement, not an ideological incitement, because it's not about ideology, because religion is an ideology in a sense, but in another sense it is a symbolic schema for the way that we interact in the social and material realms. Therefore, Baudrillard looks at what he calls the fracture internal to the dominant system, a viral structure within America itself, amongst other nations, that actually produces this need for terrorism as a last resort. Look at, for example, the Palestinian people who are trying to revolt against Israeli occupation and genocide, and they join Hamas, or they join the Palestinian Authority, or the previous PLO. These are different movements that are trying to allow these otherwise stultified people who are put in a position of utter refuse, it's trying to allow them a chance of escape. And of course, it's not a very good one or a productive one, but that's exactly the point. It's not trying to be productive. Because the idea that everything political has to be productive in both an economic and a social sense is a Western idea that Baudrillard wants to challenge here. He says that with each succeeding war, and he says that terrorism in its contemporary reincarnation is the Fourth World War, because he says that the third one is the Cold War. Kind of a, maybe not the most accurate statement, but for idiosyncrasy's sake, we'll take his word. With each succeeding war, we have moved further towards a single world order. Today, that order, which has virtually reached its culmination, finds itself grappling with the antagonistic forces scattered throughout the very heartlands of the global, in all the current convulsions. Right? So this is something not simply coming from the periphery, but as it says, and as Baudrillard puts it, this thing which is viral in structure coming from the very heart or the very center of power. A fractal war of all cells, all singularities revolting in the form of antibodies. A confrontation so impossible to pin down that the idea of war has to be rescued from time to time by spectacular set pieces, such as the Gulf War or the war in Afghanistan. But the Fourth World War is elsewhere. It is what haunts every world order, all hegemonic domination. If Islam dominated the world, terrorism would rise against Islam, for it is the world, the globe itself, which resists globalization. Right? It is the social itself, the social body, which creates these antibodies, right? I think he chooses very explicit and purposeful vocabulary here when talking about antibodies, because this is a form of disruption created within the body to achieve some state of equilibrium. But Baudrillard wants to kind of turn this on its head and show that, in fact, this is not necessarily acting for the benevolent end goal of equilibrium. In fact, as many other thinkers have shown, and Baudrillard has mentioned this in his theory throughout, that in fact capitalism and modernity itself strives to introduce situations of scarcity, of struggle, of violence, and of contention in order to do it on the West's terms, such that they end out on top. As a result, terrorism, he says, is immortal and it is immoral. It is a form of symbolic challenge which is beyond good and evil. When, for once, we have an event that defies not just morality but any form of interpretation, let us try to approach it with an understanding of evil, with a capital E. A very provocative statement, but a very good one for kind of framing what he's trying to do here. This, he says, is precisely where the crucial point lies. In the total misunderstanding on the part of Western philosophy, on the part of the Enlightenment, of the relationship between good and evil. We believe naively that the process of good, its advance in all fields, the sciences, technology, democracy, human rights, corresponds to a defeat of evil. No one seems to have understood that good and evil advance together as part of the same movement. This is kind of the idea of equiprimordiality that Heidegger mentions in Being and Time. The triumph of the one does not eclipse the other, far from it. In metaphysical terms, evil is regarded as an accidental mishap, but this axiom, from which all the Manichaean forms of the struggle of good against evil derive, is illusory. Good does not conquer evil, nor, indeed, does the reverse happen. They are at once both irreducible to each other and inextricably related. That idea of being inextricably related and yet not reducible to each other is a very important fact. That the terrorism coming from Afghanistan, coming from Syria, coming from Palestine, coming from Iraq, etc., all of these are inextricably related to colonialism and imperialism coming from the U.S., and yet nevertheless, of course, they are something other than the U.S., something which is coming to attack the U.S., but not on their own terms, on a mirrored version of the U.S.'s own terms by which they began this struggle. Ultimately, good could thwart evil only by ceasing to be good, since, by seizing for itself a global monopoly of power, it gives rise by that very act to a blowback of a proportional violence. And in fact, that is what this is. If you look at, for example, a group that is commonly called a terrorist organization, but in my opinion is more adequately called a political party, if you look at Hezbollah in Lebanon, you see that in fact they define their political project, and I've done a lecture on them if you want to learn more about their project, as a form of defensive jihad. Jihad, of course, just meaning struggle in general. It is a form of resistance, of proportional violence, which is trying to create some front, along with Iran, against Western hegemony. So therefore, if we want to find the cause of terrorism, Islam is not the place to look because, for example, there are Muslims in America who, when September 11th happened, they were totally in shock and awe. It was completely against everything that they thought that their religion stood for. Because in fact, these are two totally different Islams. Islam, just like any religion, is not homogeneous. And in fact, this is an instance in which we have, on the one hand, a very modernized, westernized, Americanized version of Islam. And over here we have the fundamentalist Salafi Islam, which is coming to really question the exigency and the origination of this Western form of Islam and Western values itself. As such, they are fighting against an integrative power, a power that is trying to integrate all outward domains into a common system of exchange. But in fact, terrorism challenges the universality of exchange, the ability that we can exchange without any leftovers. The fundamental change now, Baudrillard writes, is that the terrorists have ceased to commit suicide for no return. They are now bringing their own deaths to bear in an effective, offensive manner, in the service of an intuitive strategic insight, which is quite simply a sense of the immense fragility of the opponent. A sense that a system which has arrived at its quasi-perfection can, by that very token, be ignited by the singlest and slightest spark. They have succeeded in turning their own deaths into an absolute weapon against a system that operates on the basis of the exclusion of death, a system whose ideal is an ideal of zero deaths. And this idea of the exclusion of death is something that he talks about in Symbolic Exchange and Death, one of my favorite works of him, where he mentions that, for example, one of the basic axioms, and this is something that Foucault is going to mention, for example, is that modernity doesn't seek to relinquish control and go for a laissez-faire approach, as much as it may seem like that we are getting more hospitable to creating the material conditions by which people can control their own lives. In fact, there is an increased stricture of control and specificity and the minute manners by which behaviors are coded. And in fact, one of the ways in which this is done is by the exclusion of death, by trying to stave off death by any means. This is something that Nietzsche mentions is characteristic of what he calls the last man, someone who feels that they have triumphed over death. But by assuming that triumph, they, in fact, are the ones who have succumbed to the death of themselves the most. They have become an empty husk which can no longer live, operates not by production and creation, but by an empty reproduction of codes. Therefore, there are two things that Baudrillard says is really the revolutionary imagination, as he puts it, of terrorism. One is the shifting of the struggle into the symbolic sphere, where the rule is that of challenge, reversion, and outbidding. And two, defying the system by a gift to which it cannot respond except by its own death and its own collapse. Thus, this is a bit of an accelerationist theory, where the goal is not to challenge the system in favor of some revolutionary alternative utopia, but first, to motivate the downfall of the current system, or at least a fundamental absolute questioning of the axioms of the system via internal implosion, by reversion, outbidding, and challenge on the system's own terms. In this vertiginous cycle of the impossible exchange of death, Baudrillard says, the death of the terrorist is an infinitesimal point, but one that creates a gigantic suction or void, an enormous convection. Around this tiny point, the whole system of the real and of la puissance, power, gathers transfixed, rallies briefly, then perishes by its own hyper-efficiency. That idea of hyper-efficiency is very important to Baudrillard's project. That in fact, pure efficiency in and of itself is not necessarily something that should be our end goal. Because in fact, hyper-efficiency leads to this very overcoding that he talks about. And in fact, he wants to mention that these terrorists are not necessarily trying to prove some absolute alternative pragmatic political project. As I said with Al-Qaeda, they're not trying to create an Islamic theocracy. Rather, they are merely trying to incite violence to show who's boss, so to speak. Admittedly, as such, Baudrillard says that their deaths prove nothing. But in a system where truth itself is elusive, or do we claim to possess it, there is nothing to prove. We're not trying to prove some absolute moral maxim, but rather show the downfall of the very ability to use a moral framework by which to justify or not justify violent action. It is a dissimulation of morality as an effective system of regulation and affirmation itself. But this comes at a serious cost and is something that I always try to stress when I'm talking about Baudrillard's work of this sort, is he focuses on the privileging of the symbolic over the real. Almost to a solipsistic or idealistic point of view, he privileges the real as in fact merely a reverberated and simulacral symbolic realm itself. Here's an emblematic case. He says, the collapse of the World Trade Center towers is unimaginable, but that is not enough to make it a real event. An excess of violence is not enough to open onto reality, for reality is a principle, and it is this principle that is lost. Reality and fiction are inextricable, which is a good point. This is something that a lot of, I think, for example, Thomas Pynchon focuses a lot on reality and fiction as inextricably related concepts, that a genuine meta-history is impossible. We can only do histories. But he says, the fascination with the attack is primarily a fascination with the image. Both its exultory and its catastrophic consequences are themselves largely imaginary. And this, of course, seems to me not only repulsive, but false. The deaths of the September 11th attacks were not primarily imaginary. The material imprint it has had on the way that we live our lives and the way it has led to certain new forms of violence that are prevalent, such as school shootings. It seems to me a great disservice to this event of September 11th and its analysis to treat it as something primarily imaginary. Because while it is important to highlight the symbolic realm, I think Baudrillard, simply to be radical, wants to take it a step, in fact 2 or 3 steps, too far in privileging the symbolic. The terrorist violence here is not then a blowback of reality any more than it is a blowback of history, he says. It is not real. In a sense, it is worse. It is symbolic. Violence in itself may be perfectly banal and inoffensive. Only symbolic violence is generative of singularity. And this is important. What he's saying here is that the way by which violence lays claim to political significance requires the symbolic. Because we can have violence be treated as banal and inoffensive, as something everyday. I even see this happening today with the sort of way in which we get used to school shootings as an almost everyday news event. People of my generation have grown up with school shootings as such a regularity, such a banality, that it makes us feel jaded and hopeless at times, as if it's not something that we need to respond to because it's almost just a fact of life. That is what happens through the bare banality of reality. But in fact, to turn something into what he calls a generative singularity, Something that prompts the need for change and action and retaliation requires symbolic packaging, and that's important. It is the radicality of the spectacle, the brutality of the spectacle, which alone is original and irreducible. The spectacle of terrorism forces the terrorism of spectacle upon us. And in fact, this is something Baudrillard stresses when it comes to media theory, is that in fact the media is complicit in the rule of terrorism. In fact, to think about the way that media proliferates the need for us to watch it, a sort of compulsion that everything is breaking news and is important and is of monumental consequence, even if it's just about hell, like the Kardashians or something. This, in a sense, is an authoritarian attempt to control the mind, to turn every waking moment of our lives as modern individuals into a commodifiable, profitable instance. And that is indeed a form of terrorism, in my opinion, a theater of cruelty, as he's called it, riffing off of Artaud. It is at one and the same time the dazzling micro-model of a kernel of real violence with the maximum possible echo. And maybe there Baudrillard is giving in a little bit there, where he says, okay, there is a kernel of real violence, which in a sense he's right, that this is 18 people involved in a total restructuring of contemporary violence. It is that infinitesimal point that has almost universal, at least global, significance. Hence the purest form of spectacle, and a sacrificial model mounting the purest symbolic form of defiance to the historical and political order. And that, in fact, is what terrorism is for Baudrillard. That is the spirit of terrorism, is a purely symbolic form of defiance to the historical and political order. That being said, that is it for this lecture. I hope you found this somewhat intriguing, a very short and interesting essay to read and just have under your belt to get some of the breadth of the way that September 11th is treated in critical theory. You can check out any of my other stuff I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it helps me out a lot and I really appreciate that. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.